Jane, you mentioned that, I mean, most of your previous work had been about abuses under the Bush administration. And Obama came to office with promises of transparency. But he's had more prosecutions of governmental whistleblowers, right, in his administration than any of his predecessors. He hasn't been able to close Guantanamo. Do you think the situation in which this country is, with this sense of threat, how real or not we don't always know, is one that is leading to erosion of civil liberties?
Well, I worry that it is, because if an administration that is theoretically as different from the Bush administration sanctifies the same sorts of programs, I think it's going to be hard to get rid of some of these programs. I think, so I worry a lot about it, and I think that what's happened over the last 10 years since 9/11 or whatever number of years is that the national security community has become so entrenched and so powerful in Washington, and it's a big business too in Washington. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to push it back, and politically, it's hard to push it back in Congress too. I mean, some of not closing Guantanamo is to some extent the fault of the amount of opposition that Obama got from even trying to do it. I mean, they did try, and they didn't get very far, and they then I don't think made it a priority. And with the expansion of the drone program and these prosecutions of people who've spoken as critics of these programs to reporters, I mean, I think it's a big worry. So but I don't see it as necessarily over. I mean, I think that there's a lot of turmoil in this, and it's kind of there's pushback, but there's a big role for the press to play, I think, in exposing it.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what do you think of the drone program, and what's the reactions to that when you're on the ground? And can you imagine yourself, I don't know, as into the mind of a Pakistani who sees a drone come overhead? And in particular, how about the American fighting man? You documented some of the frustration they felt when they were receiving fire across the border from Pakistan. This was, I think, in October, not long before that major incident. What's it like on the ground on both sides?
I think for the average person who's fighting the war, the drone program is not a significant issue, because drones are politically potent because of what they can do in remote airspace, what they can do over a country where they might be uninvited. They're not especially a tactically potent weapon. They don't have a heavy payload. They're not necessarily going to be used to relieve troops under fire. And the typical infantry platoon is much more concerned about what's going on a few miles around it. And that's going to be inside of Afghanistan, unless they're a border unit. And so you don't hear a lot of discussion about the drone program when you're, walking with the rank and file. It's a much larger issue when you get next to the border, though. When you get next to the border, I think that you've got a current generation of troops who've been, essentially who have inherited real estate that was occupied and then developed in a military sense by units years ago. The local population and the local fighters know that real estate perfectly. They know where the American bases can see and where they cannot see. They know how to fight those places. And the current generation of fighters who are there are often feeling, in many ways, like sitting ducks. The rules are very tight. The war is clearly not gone well. None of them expected when they joined that 10 years later this would still be going on. That's such a hot war in the area around them, at least. And the rules are quite restrictive for fighting back. And so, I've been in fighting positions and in firefights where people have turned to me and said, hey, bro, you tell my congressman about this because I can't. You can see it. I can't say it. But you see it. Just write what you see. Do that for us, will you?
And how do you answer that? You say, oh, I'm writing a story about it.
Pardon me?
You say, I'm writing a story.
Well, you'll say, well, that's why we're here, is to write what we see. That's why we stay a long time. That's why we walk where you walk. And I think that for a lot of the troops who are out there now, they're there for institutional and personal reasons. I don't think at the rank and file there's a lot of hope that this is going to, that they are going to be able to reorder Afghanistan the way the sort of, the way that they were sort of told when they joined they might be able to. I mean, the war in some respects has run out of ideas.
Is the U.S. losing the war?
Well, losing and winning, I mean, how would you define them? Will the U.S. succeed in this broad list of tasks that it set out to do after 9/11? Will the U.S. succeed in bringing women's rights to Afghanistan? Will the U.S. succeed in effective counter-narcotic strategy against the opium trade?
Or even withdrawing and leaving behind a government that's
Will the U.S. succeed in creating a government that is made in some sort of a Western idea of what a modern government is supposed to be? I think that the answer to all these questions is of course not. That the task list got to be so long, the things they were trying to do were not what they set out to do, and that now I think that it's not a matter of winning or losing, it's a matter for them of choosing an acceptable level at which they can withdraw and at which they can feel that the world is not less safe for all of their efforts there.
Can I ask one follow-up question since we've got you? Since one of the reasons that we went into Afghanistan in the first place was to try to protect the United States against Al-Qaeda in particular and terrorism, on that one point, do you think that there's been success?
Well, you know, it's hard to measure what you can't see, and you only see terrorism when it happens. So it's very hard to tell when it didn't happen. And it's very hard to say what could have happened if you hadn't done this or if you'd done something else. So I'm pretty hesitant to answer that question.
I mean, does the end of bin Laden?
That served, I think, for
something?
most Americans at least, a sense of justice. Did that serve a national security interest going forward that you can measure? I think that's a lot harder to measure or harder to answer. The question about is Afghanistan now a safe haven or breeding ground or whatever sort of label that the security-minded person might want to assign to it, I think you can say that in some ways it's less so, that the threat has migrated out of there to a large degree. Is that success? Is that value? Is the price in blood and time and credibility of the nation worth what we got? I think how you would answer that would depend a lot on your politics. But I know that for the average, you know, I go out a lot and I ask people on the ground, so let's draw a line from what you're doing this week, this month, today, to the national security of the United States. And a lot of guys just shrug at you because they can't. They say, let's draw a line to, you know, well, we're trying to bring water to this village. We can do that. Can I connect that to saying that you're going to be safer in a shopping mall in Cleveland? No.
We're approaching a question period, so if you have questions, we have a microphone down at the bottom of either aisle. Just, just come down, state your question, please. No speeches, but bona fide questions. Sarah, I'd like to ask a larger question about sex abuse cases. I don't know if you don't remember, but if you've heard of the 80s when there was this kind of strange epidemic of charges against nursery schools, one in California, the McMillan case, I think, one in Boston, one just in New Jersey, of workers who were prosecuted, in some cases actually sent to jail on the testimony of little kids, who were in some cases led in the questioning by people who believed strongly that there was a satanic ritual afoot. And it was a very strange period in kind of the history of American psychological epidemics. It's a very, very touchy issue, obviously. You've covered, I think, other sex abuse cases. What do you think is the best way to approach this as a problem? Do you think we should have websites with the names of sexual predators. How do you balance, how do you get at the truth of a case? How do you ensure that people aren't accused unjustly or allowed to continue if they are in fact guilty?
Well, I don't even try to have the silver bullet answer to a question like that. However, I can say that probably the only rewarding thing about this experience for me has been the amount of people who are talking about sex abuse, not just child sex abuse, but all sex abuse. I had very early after the charges were brought, the psychologist for one of the alleged victims said to me, this boy, he was still 17 at the time, actually sees that what he did coming forward was a good thing because of the allegations that then, I believe it was the Citadel and then Syracuse and several other alleged victims of child sex abuse who were then adults were saying, you know what, because of these people, I'm going to tell my story too. I think that that's the biggest problem, is that we don't talk about it, so we don't educate ourselves about it. And I know that there is now this push for the Adam Walsh Act, the National Child Sex Abuse Registry. And a lot of states are deciding, again, it's politics, deciding not to comply with it because of the way that it was set up and the restraints and the cost of it and the personnel that it takes to run something like that. I don't know what the answer is on that level, but I do know that I've never interviewed a victim who said to me later, I wish I would have kept this to myself. I've never had, and maybe they exist, but they have never. I've always admired the strength of victims who are talking to me because, I imagine it's a very difficult thing to do, but I think it's very important. Always a big believer in the truth. The truth is, more facts are better than less facts, obviously. But, I think that's a situation where it's incredibly difficult to make that decision. And I do think that talking about it is important. And not just for the victims, but for those of us who don't understand it. And, that's how we educate the next generation. That's incredibly important.
I think, so I worry a lot about it, and I think that what's happened over the last 10 years since 9/11 or whatever number of years is that the national
Jane, you mentioned that, most of your previous work had been about abuses under the Bush administration.
That it is, because if an administration that is theoretically as different from the Bush administration sanctifies the same sorts of programs, I think it's going to be hard to get rid of some of these programs.
And Obama came to office with promises of transparency. But he's had more prosecutions of governmental whistleblowers, right, in his administration than any of his predecessors. He hasn't been able to close Guantanamo. Do you think the situation in which this country is, with this sense of threat, how real or not we don't always know, is one that is leading to erosion of civil liberties?
Well, I worry